Hello, Coleman229 here, another Topic of the Week video. This week, I'll be talking about the White Lotus from the Avatar series. This week's topic was submitted by Tumblr user Your Brilliant Lady M, and their topic is the White Lotus in Legend of Korra and Avatar The Last Airbender. Could you talk about their role in both shows, their build-up and the significance of Pai Sho, their plot relevance, how did they stop being a secret society in Legend of Korra, how and why all of them were benders and lacked memorable personalities, how does the Red Lotus tie into this? I didn't understand them at all. You're in good company, because I didn't understand the Red Lotus either. I mean, the Red Lotus were just stupid. They were gimmick villains. That's it. They were just a group of just gimmicks. Each of them had a gimmick. You had Zahir being a magical airbender who could literally just break any kind of previously known laws, including just flying because he feels like it. You had the Water Lady who had her watery arms. You had, Sparky Boom Girl, who was just Sparky Boom Man 2.0, but this time a woman. I think her name is Pali. Who cares? She wasn't even that much of a character anyway. You had Magma Guy, which that doesn't make sense. The whole lava bending thing, that was always something in the original series. That was an Avatar skill. The logic behind this has always been widely accepted that you're bending fire and earth. So obviously you would need to be able to do both in order to do that. Unless you have two separate benders, a firebender and an earthbender doing it, you'd have to be the Avatar. Which, alright, that's reasonable, that makes sense. No, apparently it's just an earthbending skill that you can just do, especially when Bolin is just like, hey look, I'm a lava bender now, because that's how it works, right? Ugh. Book 3 gives me such a headache. Book 3 was garbage. But yeah, the Red Lotus were stupid. And the only reason that they're called the Red Lotus is that they can be like opposite of the White Lotus. But they're not even like a real group. They're just a few, schmucks with all these crazy powers and that they want to kill the Avatar. Oh, but they're anarchists because that's, that's the political theme of the season. Because that was the political thing that Bright picked out of a hat and like, I guess we're doing this now. But, I mean, it's not even like the League of, the Legion of Doom or something, where you have, an actual organization of bad guys. It's literally just, here, guys, we just threw in there out of nowhere. And if the Red Lotus were really supposed to be so significant, so important, so notable, that they would be named as counterparts to the White Lotus, how come they were never mentioned before? Book 3 has a big problem with this overall. Looking at you, Su-Yin, about just introducing stuff that had never been mentioned before. And it's just, why wasn't this ever brought up? And the explanation can only be, no one ever asked kind of a thing. And it's just stuff that they pull out of nowhere. Like I said, Su-Yin, but the Red Lotus, they're supposed to be they wanted to kill the Avatar, and they've been locked up because they're just he's a huge threat. And why were they never mentioned in book 1 or 2? Now, if they were mentioned before in a season building up to it, this wouldn't be as big of an issue. But when you're calling them the Red Lotus, you really want to drive this parallel or the contrast between the White Lotus and the Red Lotus. The White Lotus are so sort of meaningless in Legend of Korra that it doesn't really make sense. And it feels like just that pointless fan service that Legend of Korra is filled with. Look guys, the White Lotus from Avatar The Last Airbender? This is the Red Lotus. They're bad guys. You see, red because they're bad, not white because, white means they're good, but red means they're bad. It's dumb. But to go back to the beginning of this topic, their role in both shows is overall kind of minimal. They're basically non-existent in Legend of Korra, and in book 2 they're outright non-existent, and I'll get to that a little bit in a minute. But in Avatar The Last Airbender, they weren't around much until the end of the show where they really kind of came up. But they were hinted at before, and you obviously knew that Iroh was a part of this group, but but they were a secret society, and there are all these different benders, all not just benders, but just all these different people all over the world. Like, they had no allegiance to any one nation. They were people all over the world who were part of the White Lotus. You know, you had Sokka's, sword master teacher, was it Piandao? I think so. You had Zhang, you had Bumi, you had Iroh, you had Paku, and you had all these different people from all the different nations, and they were all part of the White Lotus. And you seeing them all at the end, like all these old guys coming and just whooping butt, was freaking awesome. Because you see, like, no, these are masters. These aren't just like masters. These guys are the best of the best. So seeing them all just completely just whoop butt, and the finale was super satisfying. And it's so cool to see that, these things that Iroh had talked about before, that he did talk about in the show, about how these divisions between the nations are just arbitrary, and that, it's less about, like, a lot of times when these nations lock themselves up, they become static. And that's why that's how Iroh had developed the whole technique of lightning redirection, where he studied waterbending. He broke through his, the nationalistic barriers of the Fire Nation to say, hey, there's so much across this entire world that I can learn from that's not just firebending. So when he applied these waterbending motions to firebending and figured out a way to, to stop lightning generation, which is an ultra powerful technique used by the Fire Nation royal family. And there's that theming underneath that, these weird, like, hyper obsessive, like, oh, we are X nation, that's X nation, and we, we're only this. It's kind of dumb, and that you can't be against someone just for the sake of that they're from another nation. And we saw this even in the Fire Nation in Book 3, particularly in episodes like The Headband, where you see that there are just normal people there. Just because their leader, Ozai, is a psycho, doesn't mean that everyone here is evil, even if they have been even if you did see a lot of people brainwashed with Fire Nation propaganda. And this is one of those things where you see the traveling monks show, and this is one of the most important things for the Avatar. And I believe Zuko even mentioned this to Iroh, that, when he was telling him this stuff, that it sounded like Avatar talk. But the whole thing about the Avatar needs to know about the world. And that's the whole point of the Avatar traveling and learning the different skills and learning the different bendings. That, they become more familiar with the world, so that they're not just an Avatar of X nation. They're not just the water, Avatar. They're not the earth or fire or air Avatar. They are the world's Avatar. And the White Lotus really did sort of represent that thematically, in terms of all these different characters that you had seen across the show, going all the way back to Book 1, that all of these guys were part of the White Lotus, a grander group that broke through all of these, these national boundaries to bond together to do something positive. Like, they were there to help fight against the Fire Nation when the time was right. So it was really interesting to see that, and even though their role was overall minimal in terms of the overarching story from books 1 through 3, they did end up becoming very important. As opposed to Legend of Korra, where if you removed the White Lotus, it wouldn't really change anything at all. In fact, Book 2 outright removed the White Lotus. I mean, in Book 1, we see in the very beginning, you see those masters teaching Korra. And, they chastise her, but we don't get much explanation on these guys. In fact, if I remember correctly, we don't get a single one of these White Lotus guys named. And if they were named, it was so forgettable, they might as well have not even bothered. Because the White Lotus don't mean anything in the show. They're just there for fan service. It's just, Bright doing another one of their, hey, you remember the White Lotus? You remember the White Lotus from Avatar: The Last Airbender? We're in this show! Isn't that so cool? Legend of Korra is packed with a whole bunch of meaningless fan service, and I can point to stuff. One of the ones that always pisses me off was when Zhao showed up in the spirit world, which wouldn't have pissed me off if the writing of the show just wasn't absolute garbage, but you have Zhao coming and screaming how he's the Moon Slayer, and it's just like, okay, what's the point of this? Did anyone really care about what Zhao was up to or what happened to him if he actually survived. No. It's, or how Wan Shitong showed up and apparently was allied with Unalak, despite the fact that he hates humans. Because he made that clear in Avatar: The Last Airbender that he basically made his whole library disappear just because he wasn't going to let humans read it, and just... Okay, I need to stop because Legend of Korra is just such a complete and utter mess. But I need to go back to the White Lotus. The White Lotus appeared in the beginning, and the most interesting thing with the White Lotus in the Legend of Korra is the compound, where, Aang had wanted them to make sure that the next Avatar is safe. Completely understandable from Aang's point of view that, he was in danger a lot in Avatar: The Last Airbender, and especially because of what happened with the Air Nomad genocide. Had Aang been there, he would have been killed. So, it makes sense that Aang was taking precautions before he died, that the next Avatar would be protected. They would be properly trained, and that it would make sure that they were prepared. Unfortunately, the White Lotus very clearly misunderstood this, and instead of just training Korra, instead of just making sure she's safe, they locked her up in a compound and had her just there. She was pretty much isolated from society at large. She was taken care of, she was trained, she was fed, she was basically given anything that she could want, along with being given, basically she was the center of the world. And unfortunately, this is what led to the, obviously, selfish, arrogant, and just douchey Korra that we saw from Book 1, and pretty much the rest of the show, because Korra doesn't really change much at all. But this is, that is an interesting concept. That was always an interesting concept, and I would have loved to have seen that really delved into. I want to see exactly the conversations that went on between the White Lotus leadership and Aang. I want to see, Katara's involvement in this, and Sokka's involvement in this. What about them? What about Zuko's involvement? I want to know what exactly these people were doing. I want to know, what they were doing, if they disagreed with this, because it wasn't exactly what Aang wanted, and you had this whole squabble about what did Aang really mean when he said that, and you had the White Lotus just ultimately locking Korra up, with good intentions, obviously, but obviously making the wrong decision. I want to delve into that, because that's actually a really interesting idea. For a show that tries so hard to bring up all these interesting ideas, they never develop any of them. And then in Book 2, they completely erase the White Lotus without rhyme or reason, without even a mention of, oh yeah, the White Lotuses aren't here. No, they're just gone. And then the compound is somehow Tonraq and Tenzin's fault? Apparently they were the sole conspirators behind this, and then the show supports this? Wait, what? We know that this was made by the White Lotus. And Book 2 just erases the White Lotus because it's inconvenient in demonizing Tenzin and Korra's dad. And Korra's dad was just a nice guy. We only saw a tiny bit of him in Book 1. And of course, Mom, too. And now he's supposed to be upgraded to borderline antagonist, at least for a little bit. Why? To contrive some drama? Well, Legend of Korra is the show that you might as well just call it the Legend of Contrived Drama, especially in Book 2, where they completely screw over Aang and Katara's characters for the sole sake of giving, an episode or two of conflict between, Tenzin, Kia, and Bumi? Ugh, that was a mess. But these things are indicative of bigger problems, and the White Fang... What am I... I'm thinking too much about Ruby. The White Lotus, just being gone because it's inconvenient speaks volumes about how just awful Bryke are as writers and why they should never be in charge of stuff like that, of being head writers of shows. I really can't... I've looked into this, but I can't remember if the White Lotus ever did anything of note in Legend of Korra. I mean, really, though, if you just remove them, nothing really would have changed. I mean, what's the point of even bringing them in? Like, if they were just not gone, if they didn't show up much and they were just like, oh, well, they're a secret society and they're sort of doing their own thing and they're kind of remaining detached, I would have been, all right, that makes sense. But the fact that they bring them in as such prominent, like, characters, but then they don't give them any characters. Like in here, they mentioned the why are they benders and lacked memorable personalities. Well, we had, all these different characters. We had even Piando in Avatar: The Last Airbender, who was a non-bender, and he's the guy who taught Sokka how to sword fight. We saw that even non-benders were welcome amongst their ranks, because they didn't, shut it off if you weren't a non-bender, but of course with Bryke, non-benders are not the ones who actually get treated properly, which is so weird, because when you create a whole narrative in book 1 about how non-benders are being treated poorly, and then they themselves treat non-benders poorly, it makes you wonder just the dissonance, the dissonance between the lack of self-awareness that Brian and Mike had when they were writing this stuff. It's mind-boggling. But in Legend of Korra, I really don't remember there being any non-benders. As far as I'm aware, like, from what I've seen of the show and what I've looked into, I haven't seen any non-benders. They're all benders. And for the most part, most of them are just mooks. The White Lotus, the secret society in Avatar: The Last Airbender that was outright vital to fighting against the Fire Nation at the very end of the series, have been reduced to a bunch of mooks. Okay, I understand not everyone's going to be on the level of, like, Bumi or Iroh, but you would think that maybe we'd have some notable characters, even just a handful of these guys, give them names and some personality. You would think that would go a long way in sort of characterizing the White Lotus, but nope. It's dumb. Why would you even bring the White Lotus in if they're not even going to really mean much? At the very least, Avatar: The Last Airbender treated them as something that was built up, and it was only really revealed, like, all these, like, identities of these White Lotus members were revealed at the very end of the show. So it makes some sense that they were only hinted at throughout the show, and they would be sort of mention them here and there until the finale, and until the end. But when Legend of Korra is, like, shoving them to the forefront, and then doing even less with them, it's madness, honestly. The significance, their build-up and the significance of Pai Sho. Alright, so I talked about their build-up, but the significance of Pai Sho. Pai Sho had significance in Avatar: The Last Airbender as a way for members of the White Lotus to secretly communicate with each other. They had their own code talk, and they had their own specific things that they would do. They had the White Lotus Pai Sho tile that was very important, and Iroh was very much valued that, and Sokka even got one when he trained in the sword, and when he was finished his sword training. But it was a way specifically for the members of the White Lotus to identify themselves. And we got that really great scene, I believe it was in book 2 of Avatar: The Last Airbender, where Iroh is playing the Pai Sho game, and then all of a sudden he and the other guy are, like, putting all these tiles, and it forms the White Lotus, to sort of, like, say, all right, we're members, and this is the way we identify each other. It didn't really play, like, a huge deal. It's not like it was brought up all the time, but it was something that was used. It's important for the secret members of a secret society to be able to secretly, communicate with each other and to identify each other without going, hey, are you a member of the White Lotus? So it's just an interesting idea, and it's really just one facet of the White Lotus. But, Pai Sho was something brought up a lot by Iroh as being important, and you understand why it's important, outside of just being a game, when it comes to his relation and his membership into the Order of the White Lotus. So, that had interesting, elements to it, as basically just one element, one small piece in the overarching part of the story. Just like the White Lotus tile, it was just one piece in the bigger game. In Legend of Korra, I believe Pai Sho was mentioned. I don't ever remember it being talked about, and since the White Lotus really aren't a secret society, there's no point in having a game that you use to identify members if you can literally just go, are you a member of the White Lotus? Yeah, cool. And then that's it. It's not very exciting now, is it? And I think all this stuff really comes with Brian and Mike just misunderstanding everything that was in their own show, which of course goes back to the fact that they weren't the ones who really made the show special in the first place. There are 20 other writers that were really the ones who were writing the bulk of, really the meat and potatoes of the show. I mean, the White Lotus were probably brought in because it sounded cool. Like, on paper, this sounds cool, of bringing the Order of the White Lotus in and having them play a bigger role, and having them be around more, is an interesting idea and concept, but in execution in Legend of Korra, it was a terrible idea. Why would you even bother? Like I said, I've been saying this, why would you even bother bringing them in if they're just never going to be doing anything? Now, their plot relevance, I think I pretty much addressed that. Their plot relevance was overarching, minor in Avatar: The Last Airbender, but when it comes to Legend of Korra, they're basically just meaningless overall. I mean, they exist and they're part of stuff that happens, but the show glosses over that so much that you might as well not even bother. If you're not going to expand on the whole idea of the Order of the White Lotus compound, if you're just going to show Korra at it for less than 5 minutes before she goes off to Republic City, then really, what's the point of incorporating this? Especially when she doesn't properly develop. She doesn't develop in book 1, she doesn't develop in book 2, she really doesn't develop in books 3 and 4. By the end of the series, it's basically just throwing confetti in the air like, yay, she developed, I guess. So really, if all these issues caused by her being in the compound, which is caused by the White Lotus, ultimately doesn't even mean much for her character, then why would you bring this in and make it such a core part of Korra's character? I mean, did Brack even realize they made that a core part of Korra's character, or was it just something that incidentally happened because they didn't even think about the story? I guess it's food for thought, but I don't really have an answer to that question. How did they stop being a secret society in Legend of Korra? That's a really good question. I don't know. And I've never, like, all the years since the show started and since it ended, I haven't heard any proper explanation on why they're not a secret society anymore. I mean, at least from an in-universe, Watsonian perspective, but from an out-of-universe Doyleist point of perspective, I could probably explain that as Bryke wanted them in there, so they made them not a secret society anymore, so they could incorporate these characters in more. But then again, they didn't even do anything, so again, I'll say, what was the point? But, yeah, there's really no explanation that I've seen for why they stopped being a secret society. If they were trying to do more to help out, that's maybe one thing. But again, why would they outright stop? Why would they, this is such an integral part to what the White Lotus were. It's not just that they're a bunch of cool guys who do awesome bending and stuff. They did actually have a meaning. They didn't just jump in and, interact and stuff. They all came when they were absolutely needed in the very end of the show, when they all worked together with Aang and, the Team Avatar to, stop Ozai and his plans of taking over the world. I mean, they can still be a secret society. They can just have, keeping a watch on Korra. And you know what, now, I just thought about this, but it actually would have been far neater if the White Lotus were still a secret society, and they didn't just, walk all the time there following Korra, and weren't all just hanging out in Air Temple Island. What if they blended in? What if they were like ninjas? That would be cool. If they were like ninjas just blending into the surroundings, they're just guys who were just there, and they look like normal, your average Joes in Republic City. They'd be like, all of a sudden it pulls out, and they start fighting, and oh yeah, they remember the White Lotus, and they were hiding, they were watching Korra. That would have been a cool, little sub thing that they would, a layer to the plot to add to book 1 and even later seasons, that the White Lotus are always there, but you never see them because they're not just going to show themselves. And in fact, it actually would have been cool if we got to see Pai Sho being used. It would have been awesome if if Tenzin was a member of the White Lotus, and that would make sense, especially since he's gone to the compound, and we see him doing the Pai Sho game. Or it would have been cool if you know, when Zuko was ultimately brought into the show, if he did the whole Pai Sho thing, that would have been like, if we had that like same sort of reveal of him being like talking to a White Lotus member, but it was all like hush hush, secret, you know, stuff. That would have been cool. This is stuff that I literally just came up with. Like, I never actually really considered, you know, doing much with, like, I never really considered how I would write the White Lotus if I was rewriting Legend of Korra, but that's actually a really cool idea of just having the White Lotus everywhere. I mean, it'd be like them telling Korra, we're always watching, and we're always watching. And just be like, and when it doesn't really seem like there's anyone who can help, some guy comes up and is a secret member of the White Lotus to help them, like, fight the Equalists or something. Gosh, that's actually a neat idea. Man, talk about wasted potential. Even all these years later, there's still things that we were finding that were just wasted potential with Legend of Korra. But yeah, overall, you know, to sum up a lot of this, the White Lotus were an important member, or important part of the story of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Even if they weren't a major part of it, they were like large parts of the story that had nothing to do with them. But they were always behind the scenes doing stuff, and ultimately helped out in the finale. In Legend of Korra, they're there mainly because the idea is cool. And that can sum up a lot of Legend of Korra. Well, it sounded cool. Yeah, it sounded cool, but when you're not doing proper writing, you're not giving the proper effort into constructing a story that makes these ideas work, a neat idea is just meaningless. And the idea of bringing in the White Lotus, it's just meaningless if, well, you're not really going to do anything important with them. There's so much you could have done. And even now, I just came up with ideas of what they could have done with the White Lotus, but they just didn't. Well, I think that about sums this up. So if you want to submit a topic to me, you can comment below if you're on YouTube. And if you're just ask me whatever topic you want me to talk about. If you're on Tumblr, you can send me an ask and do topic : then whatever topic you want me to talk about. Just make sure to follow the rules I'll be posting down below. If you want to watch last week's topic video, you can check that out here. If you want to watch next week's topic video, you can check that out here when I get that done. So if there's anything else you want to talk about with the White Lotus and Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra, please comment below. And thank you for watching.